Pilger, Nebraska is one of the most studied tornado events in U.S. history. It forced meteorologists to rethink how supercells organize. Engineers used it to understand how entire towns fail under extreme winds and how they might be built safer. Government agencies re-examined how warnings are issued and why they can still fail on the ground. Even psychology turned to Pilger to understand how small communities experience, process, and carry trauma after disaster. Because what happened here did not fit rules tornado science relied on at the time, and because studying it didn't just explain one storm, it reshaped how multiple fields approach tornadoes altogether. And the question that remains is not what happened. It's why this storm forced so many disciplines to stop, reevaluate, and learn. Pilger was a small rural village with a population of just over 300 people. It had no skyline, no dense neighborhoods, and no recent history of violent tornado strikes that defined its identity. Like many small towns in northeast Nebraska, it was surrounded by farmland, connected by state highways, and shaped by routines that changed a little from day to day. Severe storms were familiar, but catastrophic tornado damage was not something most residents had personally experienced. June 16, 2014, did not begin as a day marked for history. Across northeast Nebraska, the morning passed the way early summer mornings usually do. The landscape was flat and open, dominated by farmland and small towns separated by miles of fields and highways. The weather was warm, seasonable, and familiar. For residents of this part of the state, thunderstorms were not unusual in June. Severe weather was something people understood as part of life on the plains. According to the National Weather Service, storms are expected across parts of Nebraska. Forecast discussions acknowledge the possibility of severe thunderstorms, including the potential for tornadoes. But nothing in the early outlook suggested that this day would stand apart from countless others that had come before it. The situation did not resemble the historic outbreak days that meteorologists often recognize well in advance. There were no extraordinary warnings circulating in the public conversation that morning. Pilger, Nebraska sat quietly within that environment. The National Weather Service showed no early day language that would have signaled Pilger out as a place of particular concern. There is no reason for residents to believe that their town was about to become a case study in tornado science. From a public perspective, this was a day that looked manageable. Severe weather risk existed, but it existed with normal expectations. June in Nebraska often brings thunderstorms capable of hail, strong winds, and occasional tornadoes. Communities were accustomed to monitoring weather radios, watching local forecasts, and continuing daily activities while keeping an eye on the sky. Satellite imagery from NASA's Earth Observatory later captured the storms that formed that afternoon. But those images tell a story only in hindsight. At the time, the clouds gathering over northeast Nebraska did not announce anything unprecedented to the people living below them. The NWS and NASA imagery together provided a visual grounding for this moment. A broad storm system was organizing across the region, but its early appearance did not violate the patterns forecasters had seen many times before. There was no single feature visible in the morning hours that clearly signaled a historic event. This disconnect between what was visible and what was coming is central to understanding what happened next. Forecasters that day were operating within known frameworks. They were monitoring instability, wind shear, and moisture, but those elements alone do not guarantee catastrophe. Many days feature similar ingredients without producing violent outcomes. The science of severe weather is built on probabilities, not certainties. And on June 16, 2014, the probabilities did not yet point to something extraordinary. For the people of Pilger, there was no reason to believe that their town was about to experience something no one had ever documented before in that way. There was no sense that this afternoon would be remembered in scientific journals, emergency management studies, and engineering reports. There was no expectation that satellite imagery, radar loops, and storm surveys would later be revisited again and again to understand what went wrong, or rather, what went differently. At this stage, the day belonged to routine. The uncertainty was not born of ignorance. It was born of familiarity. The weather looked like weather they had seen before. The forecast sounded like forecasts they had heard before. The town was doing what it always did on summer afternoons in Nebraska. What unfolded next did not follow the rules people thought they understood. To understand why June 16, 2014 became different, it is necessary to step away from the ground and look upward. The large-scale atmospheric event across the Central Plains that day was documented in NOAA and NCEI's June 2014 climate summaries. These reports describe a region experiencing strong instability, fueled by warm, moist air near the surface and stronger winds aloft. This combination is common in late spring and early summer, but on this day, several elements aligned in a way that allowed storms to grow unusually powerful. Moisture was streaming northward into Nebraska, providing the fuel thunderstorms require to sustain themselves. At the same time, wind shear increased with height, meaning winds near the ground were moving at different speeds and directions than winds higher in the atmosphere. This vertical wind shear is a critical ingredient in the development of rotating thunderstorms, known as supercells. According to the National Weather Service Omaha Valley Event Archive, storms began to develop and intensify over northeast Nebraska during the afternoon. One storm in particular began to show signs of strong organization. Radar imagery revealed a classic supercell structure with persistent rotation that distinguished itself from ordinary thunderstorms. Supercells are not rare on the plains, but they were responsible for the vast majority of strong and violent tornadoes. What made this storm notable was not simply its existence, but how it evolved. The Weather Channel's post-event analysis emphasizes that this storm did not behave like a typical supercell. Instead of maintaining a single dominant rotating updraft, the storm began to exhibit multiple areas of rotation. This is a critical point, because it set the stage for what would follow. At the same time, the broader environment allowed the storm to remain stable and intense. The June 16, 2014 event shows that not every storm in that outbreak behaved the same way. The Pilger storm stood out even among other severe storms occurring that week. Radar data shows increasing rotational signatures as the storm approached the area near Pilger. These signatures were consistent with tornado potential, but they did not immediately indicate that the storm would produce multiple violent tornadoes at nearly the same time. From a forecasting standpoint, the atmosphere had become supportive of significant tornadoes. Strong instability allowed air to rise rapidly. Wind shear allowed that rising air to rotate. Moisture sustained the storm's energy over time. Each of these elements is well understood in tornado science. What was not yet understood was how these elements would interact inside this particular storm. The supercell over northeast Nebraska continued to intensify as it moved eastward. Its internal structure became increasingly complex, with signs of interacting circulations developing within the same storm system. At the time, forecasters were watching a storm that they thought was only becoming more organized, not one that was breaking known patterns. There was this unseen tension between expectation and reality. Warnings were issued based on established thresholds and radar signatures. The storm met those criteria, but the atmosphere was quietly supporting something more extreme than those criteria were designed to anticipate. The environment was not chaotic, it was efficient. Everything the storm needed to intensify was available. Nothing in the atmosphere forced it to weaken or collapse. Instead, the storm sustained itself and reorganized in ways that would soon challenge existing assumptions about how tornadoes form and interact. The atmosphere was primed, but the storm was about to do something unprecedented. By the time the storm reached the area near Pilger, it had already crossed a threshold. This was no longer a question of whether a tornado might form. The storm had developed the internal structure needed to support rotation, persistence, and intensity. What happened next, however, challenged the assumptions even experienced meteorologists relied on. Two separate tornadoes formed from the same parent supercell near Pilger on June 16, 2014. Both were rated EF5. Their formation was not separated by long intervals, nor were they distant from one another. Instead, they existed nearly at the same time and in close proximity. This is the defining feature of the Pilger event. Experts emphasize how unusual this configuration was. Violent tornadoes are rare on their own. Two violent tornadoes occurring simultaneously from the same storm is rarer still. The storm did not simply cycle from one tornado to another, which is a known process in supercell behavior. Instead, multiple mesocyclones developed within the same storm system. These mesocyclones were not passive features, they interacted. Footage shows that the storm's internal dynamics allowed more than one rotating updraft to persist at the same time. Each mesocyclone was capable of producing and sustaining a violent tornado. This matters because most supercells organize around a single dominant circulation. When that circulation weakens, another may replace it, but overlap is typically brief or weak. In the Pilger storm, that expected hierarchy did not hold. The Meteorological Society describes the event as involving multiple interacting vortices, a phrase that captures both the complexity and the danger of what was unfolding. These vortices were not isolated. Their proximity meant that the behavior of one influenced the behavior of the other. Later researchers used Pilger as a reference case to examine how large, interacting vortices can alter heading, speed, and structural stability. The Pilger tornadoes demonstrated that interaction does not necessarily weaken tornadoes. In this case, it coincided with sustained intensity. The western tornado and the eastern tornado followed different paths, but they were born from the same storm, at nearly the same time, under the same atmospheric conditions. NASA Earth observatory imagery illustrated just how close these paths were, underscoring the rarity of the event. What made the storm capable of sustaining two EF4 tornadoes simultaneously was not a single anomaly. It was the combination of a highly supportive environment and a storm structure that allowed multiple rotating cores to coexist. On-site videos captured aspects of the western tornado's structure rarely documented as such proximity. These observations were not planned experiments. They were the result of researchers and storm observers being present during an event that exceeded expectations in real time. This is why Pilger drew long-term scientific attention. It was not simply destructive, it was instructive. The event forced researchers to revisit assumptions about how supercells organize, how mesocyclones interact, and how violent tornadoes can coexist without immediately interfering with one another. It provided real-world data where theory had previously relied on limited examples. From a scientific perspective, Pilger became a reference point. From a forecasting perspective, it exposed a gap between what could be detected and what could be anticipated. But while researchers would spend years analyzing radar data, videos, and storm surveys, the consequences of this rare phenomenon were already unfolding on the ground. While science works to explain it, people on the ground were already in danger. When the tornadoes reached the ground, theory gave way to evidence. Each tornado was rated EF4 based on the damage it caused. These ratings were not assigned lightly. They reflected structural destruction consistent with winds capable of leveling well-built homes and severely damaging infrastructure. The timing of the tornadoes shows how little separation there was between them. According to records, both tornadoes were active within the same narrow window of time. Their tracks ran close enough that in some areas, damage patterns overlapped and occurred within minutes of one another. These touchdowns were not brief. The tornadoes remained on the ground long enough to carve visible scars through fields, roads, and residential areas. Path length and width measurements confirm the scale of the event. EF4 tornadoes are capable of extreme damage. But what distinguished Pilger was not just intensity, it was coverage. Two violent tornadoes expanded the zone of destruction far beyond what a single track would have produced. On the ground, the damage told a precise story. University of Nebraska-Lincoln engineers conducted detailed post-event surveys using LiDAR scanning and drone-based photogrammetry. Their findings, published through university reporting, focused on how buildings failed under the forces involved. Homes were not simply damaged. Many were completely destroyed, with walls collapsed and foundations exposed. In some cases, debris was carried significant distances, indicating sustained high wind speeds rather than brief gusts. Municipal structures and community buildings showed similar patterns. Roof systems failed first, followed by a wall collapse, a sequence consistent with violent tornado damage. These observations were critical in confirming EF4 intensity and understanding how force was distributed across the built environment. The LiDAR data allowed engineers to reconstruct the damage field in 3 dimensions. This technology provided measurements of debris distribution, structural deformation, and ground scoring that traditional surveys cannot capture with the same precision. What emerged was a clear picture of efficiency. The tornadoes did not waste energy. They removed structures cleanly, stripped vegetation, and left behind patterns that aligned with known violent tornado behavior. The damage was not random. It followed the internal logic of rotating winds interacting with buildings and terrain. Visual patterns documented in photographs and survey maps showed areas where entire neighborhoods were reduced to bare ground. These patterns helped differentiate between EF3 and EF4 damage, reinforcing the conclusions reached by survey teams. Speed also played a role. The tornadoes moved quickly enough that residents had little time to react once they were directly threatened. This movement, combined with the presence of 2 simultaneous tornadoes, complicated warning response and situational awareness. From the air, the destruction appeared almost surgical. From the ground, it was overwhelming. Every data point collected by NOAA, NASA, and the university researchers corresponds to a moment when a structure failed. an object became airborne, or a landscape was permanently altered. These measurements are not abstract. They are records of force applied to places where people lived and worked. Understanding what the tornadoes did on the ground is essential because it bridges the gap between atmospheric science and human consequence. Behind every data point was a human being trying to survive it. For the people in Pilger, the tornadoes were not radar signatures or storm surveys. They were noise, pressure, and sudden absence. Eyewitness accounts collected by the Associated Press and the Daily Nebraskan consistently described confusion as the defining feature of the moment. This confusion did not come from panic alone. It came from the fact that there was more than one tornado moving on separate paths at nearly the same time. Residents were accustomed to tornado warnings. They understood sirens as a signal to seek shelter. But on June 16, 2014, those cues did not provide clarity about direction or scope. With two tornadoes active, the usual mental model, one storm, one threat, no longer applied. Survivor interviews published in the Daily Nebraskan's Too Tough to Die project describes people sheltering in basements, bathrooms, or interior rooms, believing the danger might pass in seconds, only to realize afterward that the town itself had become transformed. Some accounts describe emerging into daylight to find landmarks gone, homes unrecognizable, and streets erased. The Associated Press reporting from the day captures the immediacy of that realization. Residents described losing their homes entirely, sometimes without injury, sometimes while sustaining wounds that would only be noticed after the adrenaline faded. The focus in those early moments was not on what happened meteorologically, but on who was still alive. Survivors remember how little time there was to make decisions, with the tornadoes moving quickly and paths overlapping. The question was not which direction to flee, but whether there was time to at all. Survival depended largely on immediate access to shelter and the structural integrity of whatever space people chose. The presence of two tornadoes added another layer of disorientation. In some cases, residents believed the storm had passed, only to be struck again minutes later by a second circulation. Eyewitnesses described the day not as a single continuous event, but it felt like multiple waves of destruction that would not end, which to them felt like a new type of danger, since their expectations based on past tornado experiences no longer applied. Panic was leading, and loss was immediate. Homes were destroyed, while occupants survived inside. In other cases, residents escaped with little more than the clothes they were wearing. Fatalities associated with the event were confirmed, and injuries were significant, with 2 fatalities and 20 critical injuries. That's in a town with a population number as small as 352. And survivor stories show how close many others came to being included in that number. What stands out is the absence of clear memory. People recall confusion, noise, and silence afterward. They recall searching for neighbors. They recall not knowing whether family members were safe. Meteorologists and engineers keep explaining mesocyclone interaction, wind fields, and structural failure. Residents experience none of that abstraction. They experience a sudden collapse of the physical world they recognized. In those minutes, survival depended less on knowledge of tornado science and more on proximity to shelter, chance, and timing. When the wind stopped, a different kind of crisis began. The effectiveness of a warning system is often judged in hindsight. On June 16, 2014, the National Weather Service issued tornado warnings based on radar detection and established protocols. These warnings were timely within the operational standards used nationwide. Warnings were in place as the storm intensified and tornadoes developed. But warnings are only one part of preparedness. Surveys show some recurring challenges in rural communities regarding tornado preparedness, such as understanding what a warning means in real time. Sirens indicate danger, but they do not convey direction, scale, or the presence of multiple simultaneous threats. In Pilger, this limitation became critical. With 2 tornadoes active, residents' uncertainty about whether the warning they heard had confused them and made them panicked instead of prepared. Local emergency management response began immediately after the tornadoes passed. According to reporting, the Nebraska National Guard was deployed to assist with security, traffic control, and debris management. Guard members helped secure damaged areas, allowing emergency crews to operate safely and residents to begin assessing losses. Initial cleanup focused on search and rescue, followed by stabilization. Roads were blocked by debris, utilities were disrupted. Communication infrastructure was damaged in parts of the town. These conditions slowed response despite the rapid mobilization of resources. Small communities like Pilger face particular challenges in these moments. Limited local resources mean reliance on county, state, and federal assistance. Coordination becomes essential, but it also introduces delays and complexity. In communities where severe weather is frequent but catastrophic damage is rare, residents may underestimate the potential severity of a given event. This does not reflect negligence, but pattern recognition based on lived history. In Pilger, that history did not include violent twin tornadoes. Despite this, there were elements of preparedness that worked. Many residents were sheltering when the tornado struck. Fatalities, while tragic, were not higher given the level of destruction. This suggests that warnings did prompt protective action, even if they did not fully convey the nature of the threat. Emergency response continued in the days that followed. Cleanup operations expanded. Temporary housing solutions were organized. Volunteers arrived from surrounding communities. The National Guard presence remained visible as recovery began. But even as debris was cleared, deeper questions emerged. Preparedness is not only about minutes before impact. It's about whether communities understand risk in ways that match evolving scientific realities. The Pilger event exposed a mismatch between rare atmospheric behavior and public mental models of tornado danger. This gap would become a subject of study, not just locally, but nationally. The physical destruction was visible immediately. Homes flattened, streets altered, familiar places gone. The deeper impact took longer to surface. When the tornadoes lifted, the immediate danger ended. The consequences did not. Fatalities and injuries from the Pilger tornadoes are documented to confirm that lives were lost and others were injured, even as many residents survived amid extreme destruction. The numbers are small compared to large urban disasters, but in a town the size of Pilger, each loss carried disproportionate weight. The scale of housing destruction was immediately apparent. National and regional reporting, along with recovery assessments referenced in academic studies, describe a town where a significant portion of the housing stock was damaged or destroyed. Many residents were displaced overnight. Some homes were reduced to foundations. Others were rendered uninhabitable by structural failure, debris impact, or contamination. Displacement in a rural community functions differently than in a city. There are fewer nearby housing options. Extended family networks may live miles away. Temporary relocation often means leaving not just a home, but a way of life built around local schools, farms, and employment. Recovery studies note that in small towns, displacement can accelerate population decline even after rebuilding begins. Economic strain followed quickly. Estimated recovery costs reached into the tens of millions of dollars. For a village with limited tax base and resources, this created a dependence on state and federal assistance. FEMA public assistance programs became central to rebuilding, a process later examined in detail by the Department of Homeland Security Office of Inspector General. But recovery is not only about money, but about administrative capacity, compliance requirements, documentation, and timelines place significant burdens on local officials and institutions, including public school system. Rebuilding required navigating federal grant systems while the community itself was still in crisis. The psychological toll is less easily measured, but no less real. Trauma persisted long after the debris was cleared. Residents reported lingering anxiety during storms, altered perceptions of safety, and stress tied to uncertainty about the future. These effects were not limited to those who lost homes. They extended to the broader community, including children, educators, and first responders. In small towns, trauma is communal. People do not experience disasters individually. Loss is shared, witnessed, and remembered collectively. This can strengthen bonds, but it can also amplify strain when recovery is uneven or prolonged. Conflicts emerge during such recovery processes. These conflicts include disputes over leadership, accountability, and decision-making. These conflicts were not caused by the tornado alone, but the disaster intensified existing vulnerabilities within the community's governance structures. This is a pattern observed in other disaster-affected towns. Recovery exposes fault lines, decisions about rebuilding, funding allocation, and future planning carry emotional weight when resources are limited and losses are personal. In Pilger, these pressures reshaped relationships within the town. Recovery, then, was not a single process. It involved rebuilding homes, restoring services, reopening schools, and repairing infrastructure. It also involved renegotiating trust, redefining community identity, and deciding whether and how to remain. Some residents rebuilt, others left. The long-term consequences of the tornado were not uniform, but they were lasting. Pilger did not simply return to its pre-disaster state. It moved forward altered, carrying the imprint of June 16, 2014, into every decision that followed. Rebuilding Pilger required more than repairs. It required reinvention. Pilger is not the largest tornado disaster in American history, It is not the deadliest. It is not the most destructive by dollar value. And yet, it remains one of the most studied. Using the NOAA NCEI Storm Events Database, researchers can compare Pilger to decades of tornado events across Nebraska and the Great Plains. Violent tornadoes occur every year. EF4 and EF5 events, while rare, are not unprecedented. What sets Pilger apart is not intensity alone, but configuration. Two violent tornadoes from the same storm, active at nearly the same time, interacting within the same atmospheric system. This configuration has made Pilger a reference case in tornado science. Peer-reviewed studies and conference presentations continue to cite it when examining mesocyclone interaction, vortex dynamics, and storm-scale behavior. The event provided real-world data that could not be replicated in laboratory settings or simulations. On-site video observations published in the E-Journal of Severe Storms Meteorology offered rare visual evidence of tornado structure at close range. These observations helped validate and refine theoretical models of tornado behavior under complex storm conditions. Subsequent research, including studies on interacting vortices, used Pilger to explore how tornado paths, speed, and direction can change when multiple circulations coexist. This has implications for forecasting, particularly in recognizing scenarios where traditional assumptions may underestimate risk. Pilger also influenced how damage is documented. The University of Nebraska-Lincoln's use of LiDAR and drone-based photogrammetry demonstrated the value of high-resolution, three-dimensional damage assessment. These methods are now more widely integrated into post-tornado analysis, improving EF scale accuracy and structural failure understanding. Beyond science, Pilger contributed to discussions about warning communication. Research into public perception and preparedness, including UNL studies, highlighted the limitations of siren-based alerts and the challenges of conveying complex threats to the public. While no system can eliminate uncertainty, Pilger underscored the need for clearer messaging when storms behave outside expected patterns. In the realm of building design and policy, recovery case studies from Pilger informed conversations about resilience in rural communities. School reconstruction projects and public infrastructure rebuilds incorporated lessons about safety, space use, and long-term adaptability, as documented in architectural and recovery reports. Still, some questions remain unresolved. Tornado science has advanced, but predictability has limits. Mesocyclone interaction is better understood than it was in 2014, yet it remains difficult to anticipate in real time. Warning systems continue to improve, but human interpretation remains variable. Pilger sits at that boundary. It represents progress born from loss, knowledge gained through damage, understanding shaped by consequence. The town's experience continues to inform how meteorologists study storms, how engineers assess damage, and how communities think about preparedness. It also stands as a reminder that rare does not mean impossible. Understanding came after the damage, but the consequences continue to shape what comes next.